Oil is supposed to be simple. You pay at the pump, the fuel flows, the car moves, and life goes on. But buried inside that everyday transaction is a quiet arrangement that reshaped the global economy, rescued a collapsing empire of paper, and turned barrels of oil into one of the most powerful financial weapons in human history. Every time a ship unloads crude into a refinery, every time a jet engine roars to life on a runway, every time a government somewhere in the world buys fuel to keep the lights on, a silent rule is obeyed. Pay in dollars, or don't play at all. This isn't a law of physics. It's not even an old tradition. It's the result of a deal made in back rooms and smoke-filled palaces in the 1970s, a deal that gave the United States a new kind of empire after the old monetary order died. Most people think oil is just energy, but in the age of the petrodollar, oil became something else. It became collateral for a currency. It became the bloodstream of an invisible financial war. And without ever voting for it, the entire world was drafted into the game. Think about what a currency really needs to survive. It needs trust, it needs demand, and it needs something real tied to it, not in theory, but in practice. For most of modern history, that something real was gold. Bars and vaults, heavy, glittering, undeniable. The promise was simple. Your paper could be turned into metal. But when that promise began to break, the world faced a terrifying question. What happens when money loses its anchor? The story of the petrodollar is the story of how one country answered that question in a way that changed everything, not by going back to gold, but by tying its currency to the one thing every nation on earth needs, every single day: oil. This is not a conspiracy. It's a strategy that explains why the dollar dominates global trade decades after its gold backing vanished, why American deficits seem to expand without the usual punishment, and why access to dollars and to oil can decide whether a country prospers, stagnates, or collapses. To understand how oil became a financial weapon, we have to go back to a world where the weapon hadn't been invented yet. A world of diplomats, gold bars, and a system quietly falling apart. The year is 1944. The Second World War is not over, but its end is visible on the horizon. In a secluded hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 nations crowd into meeting rooms thick with cigarette smoke and exhaustion. Outside, the pines stand silent. Inside, the future of money is being drafted on chalkboards and notepads. The United States sits at the head of the table. Its factories are intact. Its cities are unbombed. Its vaults are full of gold, more than 2/3 of the world's official supply. In an age shattered by war, America is the creditor, the arsenal, and the banker. The deal they craft is simple on the surface and radical underneath. Every major currency will be pegged to the US dollar. The dollar itself will be pegged to gold at a fixed rate, $35 per ounce. If you are a foreign central bank, your paper dollars are not just paper. They are a claim, a promise, a ticket you can redeem for real metal in the vaults of the U.S. Treasury. Gold becomes the bedrock, the dollar becomes the bridge, and the world climbs onto it. For a while it works. In black and white newsreels, you see the story. Europe rebuilding, factories roaring back to life, ships moving along trade routes once mined and shelled. The dollar flows everywhere, into reconstruction, into trade, into savings. The system feels solid, almost permanent. But beneath the surface, the math is already turning against it. As the 1950s and 60s unfold, the United States spends heavily on Cold War alliances, on overseas bases, on the Vietnam War, on ambitious domestic programs. Dollars flood out to the world faster than gold flows in. foreign governments begin to notice a growing gap between the dollars in their reserves and the gold supposedly backing them. One by one, they test the promise. Quietly at first, they show up at the metaphorical teller window of the U.S. Treasury and say, "Here are our dollars. We'd like the gold, please." The bars leave the vault. The numbers shrink. The bridge between paper and metal starts to wobble. By the late 1960s, confidence cracks. The French send a battleship to physically retrieve their gold. Other nations line up. The U.S. faces an impossible choice: defend the gold standard and risk a brutal domestic crisis, or break the promise and hope the world accepts it. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon steps in front of the cameras. In calm, rehearsed tones, he announces that the United States will temporarily suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. The temporary measure never ends. The Bretton Woods system dies on live television. Overnight, the dollar is no longer a gold-backed note. It is just paper. Valuable only because people believe in it, and belief once shaken is hard to restore. Now the story shifts. The early 1970s are a time of escalating anxiety. Inflation creeps higher in the United States. The Vietnam War drags on. Social tensions simmer. The dollar is unmoored, floating in a sea of uncertainty. At the same time, another force is organizing. Far from Washington, in the oil fields and palaces of the Middle East. Oil-producing nations, long underpaid and politically sidelined, form a bloc, OPEC. They are tired of seeing foreign companies dominate their resources, tired of being paid in a currency that has just severed its link to gold, tired of watching Western inflation erode their earnings. In October 1973, war erupts in the Middle East. In response to Western support for Israel, Arab members of OPEC announce an oil embargo against the United States and several allies. Tankers slow, supplies tighten, prices explode. Over the course of a single year, the price of oil doesn't just rise, it multiplies. Lines of cars snake around gas stations in American suburbs. No gas signs hang in station windows. Lights are dimmed, speed limits are reduced to save fuel. For the average citizen, this feels like chaos. For policymakers, it feels like something worse. A glimpse of a world where the United States no longer sits in control of the global economic engine. At the exact moment the dollar has lost its golden anchor, the commodity the modern world depends on most, oil, is suddenly more expensive, more politicized, and more powerful than ever. In this crisis, some see only problems. Others see an opportunity. Deep inside government offices in Washington, a new kind of strategy takes shape. If gold can no longer anchor the dollar, perhaps oil can. If the world can be persuaded, or pressured, to price its oil exclusively in dollars, then every country that needs energy will automatically need dollars, permanently. The anchor would no longer sit in a vault. It would sit in the hulls of tankers and the pipes of refineries, floating, pumping, burning. And the first key to this new system is a kingdom in the desert. Imagine a palace in Saudi Arabia in the mid-1970s. Outside, the heat rises in shimmering waves over the sand. Inside, chandeliers glow above polished marble. Men in flowing robes and Western suits sit across from each other, translators murmuring, papers on the table. On one side, Saudi royals and ministers, rulers of the world's largest proven oil reserves. On the other, American officials, from the State Department, from the Treasury, from intelligence agencies, representing the issuer of the world's reserve currency. The Saudis have oil and new leverage after the embargo. They want security, weapons, and a reliable way to store their growing wealth. The Americans have military power and a wounded currency that needs a new backbone. What emerges from these meetings is not announced with fanfare. There are no parades, but it quietly rewires the global economy. Saudi Arabia agrees to price all of its oil exports exclusively in US dollars, not in gold, not in a basket of currencies, dollars only. In return, the United States offers security guarantees, weapons deals, and access to the world's deepest financial markets. The Saudis will take their surplus oil revenues, the flood of dollars pouring in, and recycle them into U.S. Treasury bonds and Western banks. Over time, other OPEC members adopt the same pattern. Oil, the lifeblood of industrial civilization, is now systematically linked to a single currency. The petrodollar is born, not as a law, not as a treaty with a catchy name, but as a network of practices, incentives, and mutual dependencies. From this point on, if you're a country that needs oil, and every modern country does, you face a simple reality. You need dollars. It doesn't matter if you're in Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe, or Asia. You can sell your goods, your services, your raw materials. But at the end of the day, to keep your economy running, you must earn or borrow enough dollars to pay for energy. Oil has become a toll road. The dollar is the only accepted ticket. To see how this works, imagine a small, energy-hungry country. It doesn't produce its own oil. It needs to import fuel to run its power plants, move its trucks, and keep its factories humming. The oil it wants is sitting offshore, in tankers loaded in the Persian Gulf. Those barrels are priced in dollars. If its own currency is called pesos, or rupees, or lira, that doesn't matter to the oil market. The seller wants dollars. So our country has exactly three options. It can export goods to the United States or to dollar-rich nations and earn dollars through trade. It can borrow dollars from global banks and bond markets, or it can try to sell something else for dollars, commodities, services, sometimes even political loyalty. In every scenario, demand for dollars is built in. It's automatic. It doesn't depend on how much people like the United States or trust its government. It depends on the fact that people like electricity, transportation, and food. Energy, not emotion, drives the demand. On the other side of this equation sit the oil exporters. When oil prices are high, they earn more dollars than their domestic economies can absorb. Those extra dollars don't just sit in vaults. They flow into Western banks and government bonds, especially U.S. Treasuries. This is called petrodollar recycling. Imagine oil wealth as a river. It flows from oil-importing nations into the coffers of oil exporters, then back into Western financial centers, where it funds deficits and lubricates credit markets. The United States, now off gold, enjoys a new privilege. It can run large trade and budget deficits, importing more than it exports, spending more than it taxes, and still find willing buyers for its debt, because those buyers need a safe place to park their oil dollars. Instead of sending gold out when it runs a deficit, it sends pieces of paper, treasury bonds, denominated in the same dollars that everyone needs to buy energy. The world ships goods, services, and oil to the U.S. The U.S. ships back claims on its future tax revenue. As long as the system holds, everyone plays along. This is not magic. It's architecture, a global arrangement where the real asset, oil, moves one way and the currency that commands it moves in a widening circle, binding economies, banks, and governments into a web of dependence. But every architecture has pressure points. Every system creates winners and losers. The petrodollar system doesn't just make the dollar strong, it makes countries that lack dollars fragile. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the world learns this the hard way. After the oil shocks, Many developing countries borrow dollars to pay their energy bills and fund ambitious development projects. Western banks, flush with recycled petrodollars, are happy to lend. Interest rates seem manageable. Growth looks promising. Then, in an effort to crush inflation at home, the U.S. Federal Reserve raises interest rates sharply. Dollar borrowing costs spike. Global demand slows. Commodity prices fall. Suddenly, those dollar debts become crushing. Countries in Latin America and beyond face a brutal arithmetic. Their export earnings drop, their interest payments soar, and they still have to import oil in dollars. What follows is the Third World debt crisis, a wave of defaults, restructurings, IMF programs, austerity. Behind the technical language lies a simple reality. In a petrodollar world, being short of dollars is not an inconvenience. It's an existential threat. At the same time, the petrodollar architecture reshapes global geopolitics. Because oil is priced in dollars and protected by American power, the security of key oil-producing regions becomes a matter of national security for the United States. Naval fleets patrol sea lanes. Bases dot the map near critical choke points. Regimes that cooperate often find themselves armed and supported. Regimes that don't find themselves isolated. And here is where the petrodollar quietly transforms from a stabilizing anchor into a potential weapon. If your economy runs on oil, and oil runs on dollars, then cutting you off from dollars can be as devastating as cutting you off from fuel. Sanctions, once a blunt tool, become a scalpel, limiting a country's access to the dollar system, to banks, to payment networks, to the ability to clear transactions for oil, can strangle its capacity to trade, invest, and grow. Its currency can collapse. Its people pay the price. From Iraq to Iran to other sanctioned states, the pattern repeats. Attempts to step outside the dollar-oil nexus are watched closely, often punished harshly, and sometimes used as justification or pretext for pressure, isolation, or even war. Again, this isn't a single villain in a dark room pulling levers. It's a system where control over the currency that prices energy translates into influence over who gets to grow and who gets to kneel. Today, most people don't think about any of this when they fill up their car or pay an electricity bill. They see a number on a pump, an app, a monthly invoice. Behind that number, however, lies a chain of events. A 1940s hotel in New Hampshire, a speech in 1971 that ended gold convertibility, an oil embargo, a handshake in a Saudi palace, and decades of quiet enforcement, economic, diplomatic, military. The petrodollar is so embedded in the machinery of global trade that it feels natural, like gravity. And yet, cracks are visible. Some countries experiment with selling or buying oil in other currencies, euros, yuan, even gold-linked schemes. Regional alliances talk about alternative payment systems. Central banks diversify their reserves, adding more gold, more non-dollar assets. The reasons vary. Sometimes it's frustration with U.S. sanctions. Sometimes it's fear of being too exposed to one country's monetary policy. Sometimes it's simple hedging, a desire not to have all eggs in one basket. But even as these experiments unfold, the legacy of the petrodollar endures. Most global oil contracts are still denominated in dollars. Most commodity trade is still invoiced in dollars. Most cross-border funding still flows through dollar-based institutions. The system is sticky. Network effects are powerful. When everyone uses the same language of money, switching to a new one is costly, risky, and slow. That's the quiet genius and the quiet danger of the petrodollar era. It turned oil, the most sought-after physical commodity, into an anchor for a fiat currency. It turned dollar dominance into something more than a legacy of war and gold. It made energy itself an enforcer. What does this mean for you? The person watching this, living your life in a world held together by agreements you never signed? It means that the price of gas or the strength of the dollar are not random headlines. They are surface ripples of a deep structure. A structure where belief, power, and raw necessity reinforce each other. Belief, because money only works if people accept it. Power, because enforcing that acceptance often requires more than polite persuasion. Necessity, because in a world built on fossil fuels, access to oil is access to life. The petrodollar turned oil into a financial weapon not by making barrels explode, but by making them conditional. Conditional on politics. Conditional on alliances. Conditional on your relationship to a currency issued by a single state. You don't have to become a currency trader or an energy analyst to care about this. It already shapes the world you inhabit, the cost of imported goods, the stability of your job, the risk of crises that seem to arrive from nowhere, but understanding it does something important. It takes the story out of the realm of mystery and puts it into the realm of design. Systems that are designed can be redesigned. Structures that were built can, over time, be rebuilt. And narratives that once seemed inevitable can be questioned. History doesn't repeat itself in tidy cycles. It moves more like a river, carving channels, changing course, sometimes flooding its banks. The gold-backed dollar was one channel. The petrodollar was another. Both were responses to the same underlying challenge. How do you persuade the world to trust your paper? In the age of gold, you held up a bar of metal. In the age of oil, you held up a barrel of crude. In both eras, you said, this piece of paper gets you that. As the energy system shifts toward renewables, toward new technologies, toward new forms of dependency, the underlying question will return again and again. What gives money its power? Is it metal in a vault? Is it oil under the sand? Is it a line of code in a database secured by math and distributed networks? Or is it, ultimately, the willingness of human beings to believe, to comply, and to organize their lives around symbols? The story of the petrodollar is a chapter in that larger saga. It shows how a currency can fall off its pedestal, find a new anchor, and turn a vital resource into an instrument of quiet coercion. It shows how the psychology of money, our fear of scarcity, our hunger for security, our readiness to obey invisible rules can be channeled into vast global systems. You cannot opt out of gravity, but you can learn how it works. The same is true of the forces that govern money and energy. If you understand how the petrodollar turned oil into a financial weapon, you are one step closer to seeing through the surface of the world, to recognizing that what looks like chaos often has a pattern, and what looks like inevitability is often nothing more than a deal someone made long before you were born. History doesn't repeat, it reveals. And the more clearly you see what it's revealing, the less surprised you'll be by the future it's already preparing.